Welcome to our workshop on dismantling systemic racism and injustice as it relates to climate change. My name is Lindsay Kirkland. I'm the Climate Change Education Manager at Climate Generation. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling you from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people in St. Cloud, Minnesota.
And hi all, my name is Seth Spencer and I'm the Education Specialist for Climate Generation, and I am coming to you from the Dakota lands in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I use he, him pronouns.
We also have Taylor Morton with us today, who we're going to invite on in just a few moments. But we're so excited to have Taylor and to talk to us about this topic today. Seth and I are coming to you from the lands of the Dakota people. I invite you to find what native lands you are on. And we've put a link in the chat to help you figure that out. When you know, you can introduce yourself in the chat and share where you're joining from today. And we'll give folks just a few moments to check that out. Great. Thanks for doing introductions in the chat, sharing the lands at which you occupy. So as folks are entering those into the chat box, I just want to acknowledge that we take time to do a native land acknowledgement because it's very easy to forget whose land we're occupying and that we are even occupying lands. Due to genocide and colonization, the lives of Indigenous peoples and communities are hidden, but we know that they're alive and they're leading change in our world. We recognize their tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions, and we seek to promote their ideas, their histories, and their work in this area. We're proud of our country's incredible diversity, and we know that our vision for an equitable future will be achieved if we work together and we share this work collaboratively. So great to see where you're all coming from. Please keep them coming in the chat. So what are we going to be doing today? I'm going to provide you with a brief grounding in our theme of dismantling systemic racism and injustice as it relates to climate change. We're going to hear from Taylor, which we're so excited about, and we'll have some time for some Q&A, hopefully. And we're also going to share some resources for you, education resources or general professional learning resources. And one more final announcements. If you're coming in, this workshop will be recorded, so we understand if you have to leave before the complete finish of the workshop, it'll be sent to you in a follow-up email. And if you need closed captioning during this workshop, you can click in your Zoom toolbar, the 3 dots, and under More, and you'll be able to find the closed captioning there. Great, let's get started. So to get us thinking about some of these concepts, I'd like to start with a poll. This is going to give us a sense of where you're at in your journey to becoming an anti-racist person and educator. So if you go to slido.com, which Seth has put into the chat box, and you type in the numbers 33667, you can participate in our poll. And Seth has provided an example here to our prompt. When you hear the word climate justice, the words climate justice, what word comes to mind for you? And if you have to answer with more than one word, just put a dot in the middle of those words and it'll help cluster. And we're going to make a word cloud. And we'll just wait a few moments for these to come in. Great. So we can see them coming in now. And I'm just going to put this back in the chat there. And as this word cloud comes up, I mean, you might have seen them already before, but the bigger the word, it means the more times it's been repeated across all of our answers. So as we're seeing equity, racism, and inequity, those are the most commonly entered words across all of our polls. We also have words of unequal access, urgency, zip codes. It's an interesting. Protecting vulnerable, basic rights, lack of accessibility, past harms, sustainability, capitalism, displacement. Yeah, these are all really heavy words, really deep words. And I'm excited to get to figure out how all these words interconnect in our understanding of what systemic racism is and what white supremacy is as it relates to climate change. And I think that poll will stay live so you can continue answering those in. But I'm going to keep going. Oops, there we go. Connecting back to our recent events with the inauguration, we took some real inspiration from Amanda Gorman's poem. And I'm going to quote her here. "We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice." Many of the most damaging and systemic impacts of the crises we were experiencing, like the pandemic and systemic racism and climate change, are hidden. Climate change is a threat to everyone's physical, mental health, and resources like air, food, water, and shelter. But climate change has a disproportionate impact on communities of color and low-income communities. People can be more prone to suffering the consequences of climate change impacts because of where they live, their health, their income, and their access to resources, limited or not. And all of these things are influenced by our socioeconomic situation and political systems in which we all live. Our current systems are founded in white supremacy and that perpetuate racism and oppression, which altogether exacerbates the impacts of climate change. And they prevent the creation of equitable and resilient communities. An example of this, which actually came up in our word cloud, which is zip codes, is redlining and racist housing policies that can lead to overheated communities or under-resourced communities, which prevent them from adapting and mitigating to climate change. We believe that climate change solutions or creating climate change solutions means explicitly confronting racism and white supremacy. So today we're going to explore some of these ideas with Taylor. Taylor is going to lead us through a discussion about We Act, which is We Act for Environmental Justice, and some of their resources. And we're going to introduce Taylor in just a few minutes. Throughout Taylor's presentation, there'll be time for questions, so you can enter those in the chat. And if we can't get to all of them, we do have a program happening next week called Ask an Expert, and you can always sign up for that to get access to it through the Teach Climate Network. And Seth's going to put the link in the chat for you. And a few more final statements from me. Some of the ideas, words, and stories you're going to hear throughout this workshop are going to challenge your understanding, and they might be difficult for you to hear. We recognize that the diversity of experiences and wisdoms, we recognize the diversity and wisdom in our community, and we value your thoughts. However, we also recognize that not everyone has equal experience and knowledge as it relates to racism, systemic injustice, and oppression. We're all learning, and to do so, we have to commit to being open-minded, and we have to engage in these hard truths, and we need to commit to making change personally and professionally. And we know that talking about this stuff is hard, and it brings up a lot of emotions. And we just recognize that we're here today to be better, and we need to figure out how do we combat racism and white supremacy in our education systems and in our personal lives. And the goal is to dismantle the deep roots of these things that have created our community and continue to build on oppressive systems. So I'm going to take just a moment, and I'm going to invite you to reflect for a second on all those things I said and set an intention for this workshop. And then if you feel comfortable, we invite you to share that intention. And you can go back to Slido. It's the same place. You can keep that browser open. And you can type in your short answer in response to the prompt. What are you hoping to get out of this workshop today? And I'm just going to wait just a moment for those to come in. And this is all anonymous. So if you are worried about sharing that, your name won't be associated. I'm going to read a few of these out. I saw practice being uncomfortable. Yeah, this is uncomfortable for a lot of us. It takes practice. More knowledge to support students. Humility. Continuing education. Learning from others, listening from others, and to leave with an action. That's great. Practice listening with openness. Tools. Learning how to be vulnerable. Yeah, these are all great. So you can keep adding those answers in, and we'd love to see them, but I'm going to actually turn it over to Taylor now, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll have Taylor introduce themselves.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. Really glad to be here. My name is Taylor Morton. I'm the Director of Environmental Health and Education at WEAC for Environmental Justice. I've been in the WEAC world for a while, worked my way up from being an intern to being a director. So that pipeline really worked out for me in this case. Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit today about environmental justice and climate justice and some of the educational work that I've been doing at WEAC. Feel free to hop in the chat at any time. Some of this will just be some lessons learned that I hope that you can take something from that, and some of it, talks a little bit about the ways that we model our educational work at WEAC. I just wanted to start with talking a little bit more about myself and how I got into this work, since this is about education. So I'm originally from the South, from South Carolina, and I'm not a native New Yorker, I'm not a native Northerner, but really got into environmental work through my family and our family history as sharecroppers and slaves. And we do a lot of hunting and fishing to continue the traditions that we use to put meat on the table and to spend time together and with each other. And that has really turned into something different for my own family. And I have a lot of roots in education, and environmental education specifically, and really went to school thinking that I was going to be sort of a more traditional environmental educator around conservation, and things didn't turn out to be that way at all. And I ended up going to an HBCU and learning more about environmental justice, and one of my big goals or things that I wanted to do out of my life is to really make sure that that young people of color had access to the outdoors, and I was able to learn more about environmental justice and really see what is preventing young kids of color, young folks in lower income communities, and kids who live in cities and across the country who don't have access to the outdoors, and in different ways that we can knock down those barriers. And so I think that a lot of what I do now feeds into creating that sort of healthier future. So a little bit about WEAC for Environmental Justice. We've been around for over 30 years in Northern Manhattan specifically, and understanding that the racial and the race and class background of Northern Manhattan and why different environmental hazards have been put uptown historically, that's really been the birth of the work that we do. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but we really focus on making sure that folks of color and folks in lower income communities participate meaningfully when we think about environmental policies, environmental practices, and things of that nature that impact our health and our life expectancy and all those things. We have an environmental health department as well as a policy department and community organizing, and we use those three sort of hubs to make change. We have a lot of different focus areas. And so this is one thing I would definitely share from my own experience in teaching in these areas. A lot of the feedback that I've gotten in the past in working with teachers and working in schools and around education has been that sometimes there isn't a spot for teaching around environmental environmental justice and climate justice. But the work that we do, I think, really speaks to the opportunities that there are to teach in these areas. So we work in most of these focus areas, and our focus areas change depending on what's happening around local policy, what our members, our residents in Northern Manhattan, residents in New York State are saying are the big issues. And those things we really try to get ahead on and be proactive on when we're thinking about environmental injustices. So most of my work is on healthy homes, and I do education across all of these focus areas. I'll talk a little bit about our educational programming that touches on some of these, but all that to say, environmental justice and climate justice, there's a lot there beyond just understanding the concepts and the terms as they sort of sit, right? And that creates a lot of different opportunities to engage in the classrooms. We've done programs on climate change and health specifically. We've done programs around food justice and toxic products, and have been able to sort of cater some of these topics to different classrooms in different age groups and all those sorts of things. So the education aspects aside, we do engage in a lot of policy and research in many of these areas. We also, I did mention, have a DC office as well as a New York office that focuses on federal policy. But I'll talk a little bit more about these focus areas and how they come into play in a moment. But wanted to take some time to really start out with some of these key terms. Key terms are a really great way to lay that foundation for understanding some of these sort of bigger topics of conversation, bigger things that you're going to be going over in a classroom. And we'll definitely say that definitions that folks use for some of these terms can differ. And we tend to use to fall back on the EPA definition of environmental justice as it relates to a lot of the work that we do. But that's definitely something to think about. If you have any local environmental justice groups that are nearby you, I highly recommend you take an opportunity to look up what definition of environmental justice that they're using. But I like to frame environmental justice with environmental injustice or environmental racism. So we fight for environmental justice, and those two key parts are the fair treatment and meaningful involvement, right, of folks, no matter their background, when we think about environmental policies and practices. And those two things, environmental injustices or environmental racism, and environmental justice, they sit in sort of a cause and effect relationship. When we think about environmental justice, we're thinking about solutions. We're thinking about things that we can do to alleviate some of these burdens on certain communities. And that's definitely more of a lens that you can use. I used to teach middle school science a couple of years ago, and we were using a book called, I think it's called The Drawdown, and it has a list of climate solutions. So we were using it as a basis for our projects. And something to think about, right? When we were using a text like that, when we're thinking about solutions, is that we want to make sure that we're having an environmental justice lens. Is this going to be fair to all people who are going to be impacted? How can we make sure that folks are being meaningfully involved in this work? And meaningful involvement, sometimes we mean that when we talk about our local government, our state government, our federal government, who's setting up some of the solutions for some of these issues and things that we're thinking about. But those are two key things when we're thinking about environmental justice that we definitely want to keep in mind. This is our executive director, Peggy Shepard. She, to talk a little bit more about We Act and who we are and what we do. She, along with 7 of her colleagues, disrupted traffic on the West Side Highway to protest a wastewater treatment plant uptown. And that really the money from the settlement was able to really give us a good start for WeAct, and we've been able to branch out to a lot of different focus areas as you've seen. But that's a key part of our work, right? We really want to make sure that we are advocating for this fair treatment and meaningful involvement, and understanding that there are two things that they impact each other, but they're really different. And those are constant struggles in the work that we do at WeAct, and things that are top of mind for us. To talk a little bit more about environmental justice and the history behind it, I found that history has been a really wonderful pair with some of the science curriculums that we've worked on. And that's been a really important part of this process. I know that someone will be able to answer this question. So we have Dr. King here. Can anybody tell me what happened in April of 1968 to Dr. King, and what he was working on while he was there? You can drop in the chat. Give a couple of seconds. Dr. King, April 1968. Yep. So we have all of the right answers here, right? So he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, and he was attending and leading and co-leading the sanitation workers strike, right? So all of that to say, the environmental justice movement is definitely a branch off of the civil rights movement in a lot of different ways, but it also sits at the intersection of a lot of other really critical movements that feed into environmental justice as we know it today. So thinking specifically about farmers' rights, workers' rights, thinking about workers' rights specifically when we're thinking about sanitation workers and what it means to work in a safe environment, in a healthy environment. But there are a lot of movements that feed into environmental justice, even when we think about movements that have been led by indigenous communities, right, around environmental injustices. So it's highly intersectional, and definitely something to look up if you're wanting to know more about the history of environmental justice. Specifically, we're thinking about in Warren County, North Carolina, that's a really key start of the environmental justice movement, which is what this picture is up here. And understanding that sanitation is a really huge part of environmental justice, especially in the 60s. But all that to say, environmental justice education tends to be highly place-based, right? The environment, as someone who used to live in South Carolina, the environmental justice issues in South Carolina are really different than the environmental justice issues in New York, right? Even the environmental justice issues in Newark, New Jersey are really different than the ones in Harlem, are different than the ones in Queens and Brooklyn, right? Even in the boroughs, and would say that largely across the country. If you're wanting to teach more about this, knowing more about the place that you want to start will give you a really big boost in honing in on whatever specific issues you're wanting to talk about, or even wanting to give an overview. Having that place-based knowledge is really important. Some snapshots in history. I'm sure folks know of some of these environmental injustice issues, thinking about Standing Rock, thinking about Flint, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey with lead issues, and Cancer Alley in Louisiana, right? So these are sort of some moments in time of the environmental justice movement, but a lot of the work that we see coming to a head has been going on for a very long time, with local organizers who have been dedicated, for most of them, dedicating their whole lives to doing this work. And there are a lot of good timelines online as well. I can go back and suggest some to send back to you all. A lot of good timelines of environmental justice that I think offer up some more case studies and examples of the work. Thinking about climate justice. So we're really, same thing when we're thinking about environmental justice, the relationship between injustice and justice. Climate justice, we're really thinking about solutions around our changing climate that's going to impact people first and worst, especially when we think about finances, health, and social and cultural disruptions, right? Something that I've been discussing in some of my talks and trying to base some of my curriculum around is this idea of resiliency as a right. That we don't have those discussions about what it means to be resilient or the cost of being resilient, or the relationships between wealth and race and the resilience and climate resiliency that we have today, right? But when we think about climate justice, resiliency is a really key part of this. And we'll find that climate justice is often connected to a lot of other justice-related issues. When we're thinking about language justice, the ways that we communicate around risk, the ways that we communicate around emergency preparedness and all these other sorts of things. But that's something to definitely keep in mind. And I think the same can be said for environmental justice as well. But when we're thinking about students and young people, that climate injustices don't skip over our young folks, that climate injustices or disruptions in the natural environment and those sorts of things can impact how students learn, can impact how students engage with certain topics and things like that. Something interesting that I've had to navigate in my experience as an educator on some of these topics is that sometimes we will be talking about hurricanes, or we're talking about food justice, or some of these topics, and students do have really personal connections to some of those issues, and that may be stratified based on race and class in your own classroom setting and the place where you are. So I think it's definitely something to keep in mind in doing this work. But when we're doing the climate justice work, we're really seeking to protect the rights of folks who are considered most vulnerable. And when we think about sharing burdens, what does that really mean, right? And what type of stress are we putting on communities that already are impacted by environmental justice issues? So when we advocate for climate justice, we're really advocating for the right for communities to survive, the right to resiliency, and that as we seek solutions around climate justice, that we are actively advocating around building resiliency for a lot of communities. Something that I've talked about in the past that will, sort of speak to the overlap between environmental justice and climate justice. I like to start when I'm talking about climate justice to talk about everyone. I mean, nowadays especially, everyone has that one hurricane that was really big for them, right? For my parents, it was Hurricane Hugo because it was the first one they had to evacuate for, and they live in South Carolina, so that was a big deal. But for me, it was Hurricane Katrina, and I remember sitting on the couch with my dad, and it was sort of like a dual conversation of, we're talking about like this really strong hurricane, right? But we're also having this racialized conversation of, why are there people who are on screen who look like us, who are asking for help? And, those are really tough conversations to have, and to have over a certain amount of time, and all of that to say, right? We're seeing today that there are a lot of environmental justice communities that are being impacted by climate events, so that the climate justice and environmental justice issues are very much merged in a lot of different ways. Thinking about a place like Louisiana, right? Thinking about an area that is ranking low on wealth and education and all of these other sort of social issues, and what it means for folks to build resiliency and to be exposed by chemical plants and other environmental justice issues can become pretty complicated. So thinking about climate justice and environmental justice, to compare the two terms, both really have this focus on social justice and equal rights, and really rally around the fair treatment and meaningful involvement. But we're seeing as well that a lot of the communities that have been historically impacted by those environmental justice issues are also impacted by worse by those climate justice issues. And what we've seen in COVID, thinking about pre-existing conditions, will definitely come into play as we experience more of those climate injustices. To talk a little bit about, I was looking in the chat to see if there are any questions, but I think we're good. Feel free to drop any in there as you go. So as we're thinking about, I mentioned that environmental justice work is highly intersectional, thinking about the intersection between health, justice, and education. Something that we use in our work in the environmental health department is thinking about social determinants of health. And what are these other things, these other aspects that influence our health status? And the way that you look at some of these issues, depending on the communities that you're talking about, the solutions can get kind of hairy. So we're thinking about an example that I always use, we're thinking about social determinants of health, and we're talking about neighborhood and environment. Maybe the solution, maybe if we're talking about walkability is something that we want for folks to, for folks to have, right? We want folks to be able to walk to more places and engage in that, right? But maybe it's not safe, right? Maybe they don't feel safe for a number of different reasons, right? The solution that you find may work for folks who identify as African-American or of African descent, but may not work for folks who are Latinx. It may not work for folks who are queer, right? There are a lot of different overlapping pieces to social determinants of health. But that really gives an opening to merging sort of these conversations around some of these scientific pieces and some of the social pieces, which can be kind of difficult. A really great tool that I've used, I know I'm in New York City, but if you are anywhere else, you probably have a tool that's similar to this. We've been using information from the city's environmental health and data portal. That's worked out for us really well. I know New York State also has a data portal, and the CDC has a national portal. As I said before, a lot of states have them. I was just working with an educator who was working on curriculum for I think like 5th and 6th grade students. And we found a model that works in Oklahoma City that shows some of this information. So all of this to say, this is going to be in the scope of New York City, but take it all with a grain of salt, because there's likely a model that you can use for your own area. But looking at life expectancy is a really visual way to convey some of the information around climate and environment. A lot of times in K through 12 education, you're doing some of the exercises around mapping, you're introducing it, talking about what is a legend, what is a key, and some of those things. So it's been a really useful tool for us, but we've been having these discussions around what does it mean for certain areas of New York City to have a different life expectancy than others, right? And there are a lot of different things that go into life expectancy, and I can share a tool that we use with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that sort of displays that your life expectancy can be determined by the zip code that you live in. And there are a lot of different factors that go into that, thinking about the social determinants of health that I just mentioned, right? Thinking about how close you are to healthy food, what's the wealth of income level of the folks in your community. Are you living close to an environmental hazard and things like that? What's the quality of the air that you're breathing? All of these things can really piece together and show you really tangible things around your own community, and can highlight some of the environmental justice issues. So this is the, I'll drop the link in the chat when I'm finished, but this is just an example of what that tool looks like. So I can drop in my zip code in New York and my zip code in Atlanta, and it will show me that the life expectancy is different in these places. And sometimes it doesn't go into depth around like why it's different, but they will tell you how it's calculated. And that's another good way to figure out what environmental justice issues you want to focus on. Maybe you're teaching chemistry and you want to focus on food justice as an aspect of this work. You might be able to, for example, the New York data portal has a map of the number of bodegas that you live next to, right? Or it'll show you like the number of green markets that you live next to, things like that, that can offer a bridge to having some of those conversations around climate justice and environmental justice, and something to think about. For example, just to highlight what we've been doing and sort of where we are, you can see in New York City, there are areas that will show you the percent. They tell you as well on the page too how they calculate some of these numbers. So you can look at the percent of folks who identify as non-white, right? And see that in those areas, and we're thinking about parts of the Bronx and parts of northern Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens as well, right? When we look at school absenteeism, so the number of kids who are chronically absent throughout the school year, right? We can overlap that with looking at the number of asthma visits for children from ages 5 to 17, right? That the city releases this information, but we can also see in the Bronx and parts of northern Manhattan and some of those areas that have been impacted before, that folks are being affected, especially kids, right? Youth, as we're thinking about it. Looking at lead as well. Lead is a really big issue in New York City. And when we're thinking about homes with peeling paint, and that lead exposure to children is also impactful. You know, that's something that we definitely keep our eye on at We Act, right? But we're able to see some of those areas that have been impacted on some of those other maps are areas that are impacted on these topics as well. All of that to say, environmental justice communities tend to have a lot of environmental injustices at once, right? It rarely is it ever like, here's a community they're dealing with lead, that's it, right? There oftentimes are other environmental injustices that are happening in that place and space at the same time, right? And often when we think about why certain communities have been chosen to be the home of certain environmental hazards, right? We can really think at a intersectional level around race, class, and power, and the way that we use our environment, the way that we distribute resources, to start having those conversations in our classrooms. And here's the data and the information that we can sort of use as a transport for some of those conversations, or starting some of those conversations. To talk a little bit more about some of the programs that we have done in the past. So we have a program called the Youth EHJLT. EHJLT stands for Environmental Health and Justice Leadership Training. But we've been working with a school in Washington Heights on this program for a very long time, and have been able to focus on certain issues. I mentioned those focus areas, focus on certain issues that students have really wanted to engage on. And we've had an opportunity as well to allow students to do some projects where some of our staff come in and get feedback on the projects, talk about what's realistic, and what they've been doing in Washington Heights and what they've been doing in the community that will sort of give a more lifelike form to this work and what we've been doing, but you know, also providing a really like tangible and influential experience for students who want to do this work or who want to know more about environmental justice and helping their communities. And the last piece I wanted to talk about, levels of activism. A lot of times feedback that I've gotten from educators that I work with is, well, we've gotten through the sort of conceptual parts of like what we want to do, but you know, we're really trying to think of like actionable things that we can do. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the ways that we take action at WeAct. And we don't work as often around the global level, but we do a lot of work around the national, which includes the state and federal levels and the local levels as well. Specifically around policy, lobbying. We get involved in elections in some type of way, or civics at least. But do a lot of our work, which I think a lot of the work that we've done with students as far as getting them involved in participatory budgeting processes and talking to their community boards and other local level governments has been really good and influential. And I think anyone who's wanting to do that action, I would definitely start out at the local level to sort of see what ways you can make change with students. But we've done a lot of work with community organizations and we have a membership as well that we do a lot of individual and interpersonal work. So I know not all of you are in New York City or New York State, but getting in touch with a local environmental justice group can be a really great way to plug in with students and plug in with youth. And sometimes that might take work. A lot of times groups who do work on environmental justice issues don't have environmental justice in their name. Sometimes they work on food justice, sometimes they work on housing and some of those other topics. But the work that they do lends itself well to environmental justice and alleviating environmental injustices. So that's something that I would definitely keep in mind as you dig into this work. If you want to be involved with WEAC, I definitely would encourage you to become a member. I think it's $25, but I think it's like pay what you would like. So I'll drop the link in the chat as well to anyone who's wanting to join. We do have working groups and a very active newsletter and social media presence as well. If you want to hear more about what we've been doing, or if you want to, collaborate on a project or anything like that. So I think that's all I have. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Taylor. We did have a few questions come into the chat, and I'll just repost them for you to see here. And then we'll go through some of those, and then I'll follow up with a few connections back to the classroom.
Yeah. So I see the question here. So do I have any suggestions on how to explore this information with youth who live in these zip codes who may feel scared or harmed by the information? I think for us, student experience has been a really good place to start. So I think seeing, meeting students wherever they are is a good place to start. And I think I didn't use community agreements as much in my classroom when I was a middle school teacher as I would have wanted to. But that can be a really good way to, as you're starting to have these conversations, get a temperature check on where folks are, and maybe get a better read on what is scaring students, or what about the information is harmful. And yeah, I think the other part of it is like, sometimes I think there have been times where I've taught, even with the wheel students, I've wanted to get in deep to some of the topics, and I haven't been able to do that because students weren't there yet. And that's okay. So I would just recommend definitely meeting them where they are. And as I mentioned before, the work is pretty intersectional. So I think if you needed to find something that was maybe a little more leaning into science than into some of the social aspects to start, that you could transition into having those conversations as you go. How do we suggest getting school districts to see the intersectionality between some of these topics? Tough to get folks to talk on board. That's a good question. I think there's a lot of evidence that really supports the expanse of the anti-racism work. I think a really good place to start is even thinking about some of the topics that tend to be more intersectional. So thinking about COVID and race and health, right? The idea of pre-existing conditions is a good walk in the door to talking about racial justice and health and wealth and distribution and all those sorts of things. I think especially if you have like students or folks in your community who have been impacted, worse by some of these issues, that can be a really good starting place. But I think there are a lot of cases like that where some of those discussions tend to happen. Even thinking about the gentrification of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, right? That I imagine in the future that that gentrification and climate change will be a very close pair when we think about wealth distribution, race, and environmental and climate justice. So I think really trying to dig in your heels to some of those more specific cases will benefit you. But I think too, even I think there may be even some really good resources around anti-racism work and the expanse of it, right? That climate justice work and racial justice work are related, as are work around wealth and all of these other justices. So it fits under the umbrella of like anti-racism work when we're thinking about undoing these systems and trying to repair and heal communities and actively doing that work. So I feel like that's part of it, is making the argument and finding those cases that really highlight the connections between racial justice, climate justice, environmental justice, and health.
And Taylor, thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences and knowledge with us. I know that there were a couple of questions we missed, and we'll connect those with you and send them out. I do want to take the last 10 minutes or so just to make some connections back to the classroom and some things you can do with your students. So Lindsay is going to share the screen here, and we'll finish up shortly. We recognize this is a lot of information. We do want to take a few minutes to tie this directly back to the classroom and things you can do with your students. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. If you missed seeing Amanda Gorman's poem yesterday during the inauguration, I definitely recommend checking it out. And I'm also going to put in the chat here a lesson plan that has already been put together by PBS that you can, again, share with your students. We're going to move into another Slido poll. So Taylor just shared this amazing wealth of things that we can do. And we want to know, what are your intentions moving forward? You have had no time to reflect on any of that, but if you can go to that Slido poll again and just type in a few short answers here, and we'll just see what folks are currently thinking. So we have continued to learn. look up at local environmental justice organizations, continue to learn and adjust my work, be more intentional about what you're doing with your students, always be humble about what I don't know. I think that's key. Research resources. Make sure that any organization I work with going forward has environmental justice as a piece. Great. Okay. And again, we'll leave that live for folks to put in there, but I think we'll move on to the next slide. Addressing anti-racism in the classroom sounds challenging, because it is. Here are a few tips to help you get started. Decenter yourself. As hard as it may be, and as much as we may want to, don't look away. History is unfolding before our eyes, and racial injustice is once again at the center. Learn history. We as educators often limit ourselves in learning about 21st century education and pedagogy and fail to look at the hundreds of years that BIPOC communities have suffered as a result of white supremacy. While understanding slavery and racism is important, there are also amazing accomplishments and achievements that usually go unmentioned or overlooked. Understand equity. We need to deepen and extend our understanding of equity to include the dismantling of systems sustaining these inequities. In this understanding, we must acknowledge that diversity and inclusion on their own will not change outcomes for students. Don't wait. The first step is, of course, talking about racism, but we can't pause and wait for people to catch up or feel comfortable. We have an ongoing crisis in our country where people have spent hundreds of years feeling uncomfortable, and as a result of our inability or unwillingness to act. Being anti-racist as an educator should be the rule, not the exception. Build community. Finally, making sure our students are active participants in this learning. Focusing on a project-based curriculum where students are actively engaged in sharing their perspectives about dismantling systemic racism is key. I'm going to share you a piece of inspiration from a fellow educator. In June, when the Black Lives Matter protests first broke out in cities across the country, something clicked for Joanna Chacon and Dr. Candace Sumner, teachers at Newton South High School in Massachusetts. They began a book club about anti-racism, which quickly spread across the country and eventually developed into the National Educator Anti-Racism Conference with over 6,000 virtual attendees. There were sessions ranging from early childhood and anti-racism to English and science education in anti-racism. You can check out the conference website for numerous session recordings, which I'll pop into the chat here. Now, as Lindsay mentioned, if you are looking for more resources on climate change education and you haven't already joined, please do sign up for our Teach Climate Network. And then, of course, make sure to check out our curriculum suite, research-based and standards-based lessons for grades 3 through 12 on the Climate Generation website that I'll also pop in the chat. And of course, as Lindsay mentioned, we are going to be sending out an email with all of these links and documents, so don't feel like you have to quickly copy something down. We want to again send out a huge thank you to Taylor for agreeing to collaborate on this incredibly powerful and important and difficult topic. Moving forward, we ask a few things of you. Be kind to yourself and have patience. Becoming an anti-racist person and educator takes work and time. You will make mistakes. When that happens, apologize and set an intention to do better next time. Know that you are a part of a community of educators that is trying to be better, to make the education system a more just place for all of our students. We will be sending a follow-up email with all the links and resources And again, thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. And one final huge thank you to Taylor for presenting. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much, Taylor. That was amazing. Those resources and ideas were great. Yeah. Finished hands. Thank you.